The purpose of this academic poster and accompanying audio podcast is to examine the innovation of ecotourism and how it has impacted the travel and tourism industry. The changing nature of the tourism and hospitality industry relies upon the introduction of innovative products. Ecotourism has historically been used as a marketing tool in order to promote tourism businesses related to nature, but it is vital that ecotourism is seen beyond the appealing and fashionable eco-label that previously industries have made it. But before investigating why ecotourism is an innovation, its emergence in the industry, and how it differs from alternative tourism forms, it's important to first define what the term ecotourism actually means. In more simple terms, ecotourism has been defined as nature-based tourism that attempts to minimize its environmental impacts. However, with further research and a mountain of new perspectives, ecotourism is now defined as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well-being of the local people, and involves interpretation and education. With some key characteristics and principles of ecotourism being that the goal of companies and destinations promoting ecotourism should be to move ecotourism beyond a new niche within natural travel. As stated, ecotourism takes a more ecological approach, whereas sustainable tourism looks at tourism holistically and instead is often broken down into three pillars: economic, social, and lastly environmental. Therefore, forms of alternative tourism have stemmed from this breakdown, ecotourism being one of them. Sustainable tourism can be used as an umbrella for a range of alternative tourism forms. In fact, the Mohonk Agreement saw ecotourism as sustainable tourism with a natural area focus, which benefits the environment and communities visited and fosters environmental and cultural understanding, appreciation, and awareness. This, of course, varies dramatically compared to mass tourism. Mass tourism has a more standardized look, as holidays are usually packaged for customers without being very flexible. Tour operators such as TUI and previously Thomas Cook could be seen as poster children for mass tourism holidays, trusting hundreds and thousands of tourists to destinations yearly. As stated, there is just a thin line of differentiation between sustainable tourism and ecotourism, which also shows that there is no absolute boundary between sustainable and unsustainable tourism. Ecotourism's emergence from the tourism industry has been traced back as far as Hetzer in 1965, who used it to explain the intrinsic relationship between tourists and the environments and cultures in which they interact. As such, Hetzer identified four fundamental pillars that need to be followed for a more responsible form of tourism. Thus, according to Hetzer, the development of the concept of ecotourism grew as accumulation of dissatisfaction with governments and societies' negative approach to development, especially from an ecological point of view. Even though climate change and sustainability nowadays seems to be in the news and spoken about a lot more, Nelson adopts the same particular approach in illustrating that the idea of ecotourism is in fact a considerably older one rather than new, which actually manifested itself during the 1960s and 70s. Researchers began to become concerned over the inappropriate use of natural resources, therefore developed ecotourism. It is suggested that due to the emergence of global marketplace, there has been a push for the tourism and hospitality industry to transform itself into a customer-based service. This means that any new innovations developed for the tourism industry will be a lot more customer-focused and will take consumers' perspective seriously. Therefore, from the demand side of the industry, travellers have a variety of choice and new innovations will make their lives easier when travelling. But from the supply side, environmental, social impact and the local economy must be considered. This is due to customers travelling to see the destination. If the destination is not protected environmentally, local people aren't involved in a way that suits them, and tourism isn't benefiting the local economy, the destinations cannot supply tourists with what they demand. Destinations therefore need innovations such as ecotourism to sustain the demand from the industry by protecting the environment, but from the supply side they must consider the environment and communities as well. As detailed, with the changing nature of the tourism industry and with many new innovations to ease service experience and to promote customer satisfaction, there's a direct need to overcome the damage many new innovations cause on destinations. For instance, innovations such as Skyscanner, Booking.com and Google Flights allow users to search and book flights in seconds. However, there is no innovation which turns low-costing, quick and easy flying into green reusable energy, and as such is bad for the environment. As it has been noted that, like most commercial activities, Tourism has produced both beneficial and detrimental environmental and socio-cultural impacts, some of which may be irreversible. And although ecotourism itself is an innovation that customers have demanded, it has been evidence that its concepts and innovations are focused around protecting the environment by utilising the rawness as an attraction for tourists and therefore cannot be put into the same category as mass tourism and its associated activities. As such, a major trend reaching worldwide news is the global issue of climate change. The current trend is of particular significance because it is of extremely likely to be the result of human activity and proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented. In return, consumers and visitors are becoming more aware of how they travel, their travel activities, and how the airline and destination is operating. In AS2's Yearly Travel Trends Report of 2019, it said that 55% of holidaymakers are increasingly aware of the impacts they have on a destination when they go away, with 45% of people saying sustainability is an important element when booking a holiday. In short, it is essential that concepts and innovations such as ecotourism are implemented to undo the detrimental impacts tourism has created, therefore meeting the supply side of innovations. From the demand side, it has been made apparent that customers are too wanting to become more sustainable and are much more conscious of their environmental choices. It's also important to note that destinations and businesses are generally working all towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and those who sign the Paris Agreement will have to legally be abiding by Agenda 21 by 2030. Therefore, the importance of an innovation such as ecotourism is even more compelling to those businesses and destinations working towards becoming carbon neutral, reducing their carbon footprint, and wanting to achieve the UN's SDGs. Previously identified, ecotourism is part of a broader category of alternative tourism, which sprouted in response to negative environmental impacts of mass tourism. Contextualised to Costa Rica, environmental protection has been discussed by the Costa Rican government dating back as early as the 1930s. Scientists and environmental activists in Latin America were concerned about the lodging, farming and human settlement which were contributing to Costa Rica's environmental degradation, threatening local flora and fauna. The introduction of environmental awareness was also due to the community's desire and the influence of environmental education from biologists that saw the Congress of Costa Rica pass the Forestry Bill in 1969, which created a system of 20 parks protecting 25% of the country's landmass. Fast forward to the present day, Costa Rica can now be seen as a poster child for ecotourism and sustainable development. Eco-lodges and ecotourism in general are effective ways to rectify the negative environmental impacts that are brought about from mass tourism. As formerly argued, the tourism industry can generate both positive and negative impacts on the environment. As such, tourism has been identified as an important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for about 5% of the global emissions of carbon dioxide. Thus, given the predicted growth of tourism in most countries, emissions from global tourism are expected to increase by 150% by 2035. To undo these detrimental effects, many businesses such as airlines and hotels they now use carbon credits, which are used in a concept known as carbon offsetting. A carbon offset is a way to compensate for your emissions by funding an equivalent carbon dioxide saving elsewhere. Everyday actions consume energy and produce carbon emissions, such as driving, flying, and heating buildings. Carbon offsetting is used to balance out these emissions by helping to pay for emission savings in other parts of the world. If a destination was to offset all of their carbon, they would then be considered carbon neutral. In fact, carbon footprint would define carbon neutral as a term used to describe the state of entity where the carbon emissions caused have been balanced out by funding an equivalent amount of carbon savings elsewhere in the world. Many destinations, especially small island destinations like Costa Rica, who are vulnerable to climate change, have voiced their ambitions to become carbon neutral, although of the countries that have engaged, few have serious plans. Likewise, airlines such as British Airways have shown that they plan to reduce their carbon, therefore having to buy carbon credits to balance out their impacts on the environment due to the nature of their business. Clearly, operating sustainably and becoming environmentally friendly is potentially changing the way tourism businesses operate. However, there are implications where to state they operate sustainably and carbon offset or are trying to reach becoming carbon neutral, although those that are not operating truthfully can often be labelled as greenwashing. Some businesses and companies will use a term commonly known as greenwashing, which is defined by NGO Greenpeace as the act of misleading consumers regarding the environmental practices of a company or the environmental benefits of a product or service. In other words, some companies use environmental friendly, carbon neutral, or sustainability as merely a marketing tool because they feel this is what customers want to hear. As it has already been identified, consumers are becoming more conscious with how they holiday. Even more, there is a concern that the act of greenwashing may cause consumers to become increasingly delusional and therefore skeptical of ecotourism altogether. The definition and characteristics of ecotourism previously stated are commonly referred to by academics. When companies operate sustainably and are eco-friendly, it makes many question, what is true ecotourism? In principle, there exist three key pillars to ecotourism, as shown on the accompanying poster presentation. Although dimensions of ecotourism development refer to the environmental, economic, and social aspects, and a suitable balance between these dimensions must be established to maintain its long-term sustainability. Therefore, it could be said that ecotourism is not necessarily the way forward for the tourism industry to overcome the environmental issues the industry has caused over time. Instead, ecotourism and a handful of other alternatives to mass tourism are needed to create sustainable tourism. As the Commission report notes, economic growth and environmental conservation are not only compatible, but they are necessary partners. One cannot exist without the other. Therefore, ecotourism cannot stand alone. As alluded to before, ecotourism must work in collaboration with a range of different alternatives to mass tourism to actually be sustainable. Nevertheless, from a tourism business and destination perspective, the need to abide by Agenda 21 will shape how well tourism businesses and destinations implement sustainability. The United Nations SDGs aim to be achieved by 2030, and all countries who signed the Paris Agreement in 2015 must be operating and practicing sustainably, making sustainability a rather than a desirable. AS2's trends for 2021 also indicate many destinations and travel businesses have been using this time to progress existing thinking on sustainability and introduce new strategies to rebuild more resiliently. Although in the same report it is also predicted that due to the pandemic that many tourists will return to what they know and do best, package holidays. Based on the arguments and points made on the posted presentation, it is believed that ecotourism and eco-friendly practices will be introduced into more and more businesses' sustainability schemes. Hotels and airlines in particular will start, if not continue to state what they are doing to reverse their effects on the environment. Whether they are truthful or not is the business's discretion. Ecotourism, as evidence, is not a new concept that people and businesses fail to understand. The concepts and principles are plain and simple. Additionally, with social media and influencers such as Greta Thunberg and the 2030 target for the UN's SDGs, ecotourism cannot be unfairly labelled as a trend. Moreover, with the coronavirus pandemic and the crisis that's been felt throughout all industries, but particularly the tourism industry, the desire and need for consumers to travel, explore, and relax is likely to overrule a lot of the environmental mindsets that have been installed since the pandemic hit. Therefore, this is not to say that ecotourism, accommodation, and programs become redundant, but the eagerness to visit and travel to ecotourism sites may be simply overshadowed by the quick, easy option to travel to a hot, sunny climate to relax and forget about everything the pandemic has hindered. Although, if 5-star accessible ecotourism accommodation and sites are as user-friendly as mass tourism websites and booking systems, there is nothing to discredit that ecotourism lodges and accommodation could be just as popular in the future.